Shoshana, thank you very much, and thank you to the Jewish Policy Center and AJIRI for pulling us all together. The work that Ambassador Schifter has done is legendary, influential, important, and indeed has been an essential factor in keeping the issue of how the United Nations has treated and mistreated Israel in the forefront of the minds of both the diplomats, politicians, and the public. We owe a great debt of gratitude, and we owe particular honor to Ambassador Schifter for his lifetime of service. I was asked by Shoshana to address the state of anti-Semitism in the world today, and in that context, we gather here in the offices of Congress, a most appropriate place to actually discuss the enduring battles against both anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, and Holocaust denial, because there is indeed a confluence of problems with each of those particular areas. We know the history of what has occurred most recently. It is beyond comprehension that here we are 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, that the Jewish people are renewed as popular victims. We find Holocaust denial to be more pervasive than we have experienced in quite a long period of time. We used to fear that the Holocaust would be painted as a Spielberg movie. Now it is painted as a concoction of all of the Jewish people led by Israel. At the United Nations, the ambassadors who are there serve at the pleasure of their presidents, their prime ministers, their foreign ministers. They take direction when it comes to voting. They take direction when it comes to thinking. What they might say in the back room, even to the ambassador from Israel or the ambassador from the United States, what they might say in the back room is totally different from what indeed they do when it comes to voting. To understand their votes, I would like to put in context the important factors that I'm not sure many of us have focused on. I would like to address first the Jewish presence in the world, including where Jews are and where Jews are not. There are 14.6 million Jews in the world at the beginning of 2018, and less than 0.2% of the world population has less than 1/3 of the global percentage of the Jews that existed in 1900. 12.3 million of the Jewish people are in Israel today and in the United States, constituting 84% of the Jewish population. Let's look at where the Jewish people do not exist. At the start of 2018, only 9 countries in the world had more than 100,000 Jewish citizens. Put that in perspective. The football stadium at my alma mater, the University of Michigan, seats 107,601 people. The Jewish population is 95.3% of all UN member countries, which could not fill that stadium. But as most of you are unlikely to have ever visited that stadium, let's look for something a little closer to home. The home of our World Series champion Nationals. They have 41,313 seats. Only 17 countries are home to more than 20,000 Jewish people throughout the world. 17 countries out of the 190-some countries that have votes, one country, one vote at the United Nations. The Jewish population for 91.1% of all UN member countries, therefore, could not fill collectively half of Nats Stadium. This illustrates how many UN ambassadors really have very little knowledge of Jewish people or even of the state of Israel, except what they're told except for what they read, except for what they might observe, or except for how they are instructed, until perhaps when they come to the United Nations. That's not to say that UN ambassadors don't go through their foreign ministries and serve in positions and somewhere along the line interface with U.S. diplomats, or more particularly diplomats from the State of Israel. But their real knowledge comes only at that diplomatic level. It doesn't come from any sense of the Jewish people as a people. It doesn't come from any sense of the history, the rich history of the Jewish people. It doesn't come from any sense of an understanding of the ancestral rights of Israel and the Jewish people. Think about the fact that if any people in the world were returning after thousands of years to their ancient homeland, and they were considered to be an indigenous tribe, if you will, or indigenous group of people, the world would indeed applaud, except when it comes to the Jewish people's rights to the land of the State of Israel. Let's take a look at the population makeup. I've already referenced the Jewish population. 117 countries have a Christian majority. 50 countries have a Muslim majority. Between the two, we're talking about 86.5% of UN membership today. Why are we talking about this? To understand the role that the United Nations has played in demonizing Israel, in working to delegitimize Israel, and in literally supporting the human rights violators of the world, the haters of the world, who like to put Israel out front as that apartheid, racist, criminal state. Because you see, if you can blame somebody else, you don't have to carry blame onto yourself. In the time period 2006 to 2016, the UN Human Rights Council and its predecessor adopted more resolutions criticizing Israel than resolutions criticizing all the other countries combined. And in addition, in the General Assembly, the GA passed 4 times as many resolutions criticizing Israel than criticizing all other countries. Let's put all of this together. The message being sent by the United Nations with almost every one of their votes, although we've recently seen some change, and I'm going to comment on that in a moment, is that one Jewish country, the Jewish State of Israel, commits more human rights violations than the rest of the world combined. Over 90% of UN member countries literally do not have enough Jewish people in their country to have any sense of what an allegation of human rights violation is against the Jewish people and against Israel. Because let's face it, there is no difference. For those who say, we're against Israel, we're not against the Jews. For those who say we're against the Zionists, we're not against the Jews. The fact of the matter is, there is no difference. This is the one Jewish state that exists and that is sanctioned as a sovereign state, a full member state of the United Nations, and she deserves the same respect as every other country at the United Nations. So when 22 Arab countries launched an agenda to demonize and therefore isolate Israel in the UN in the 1970s with the adoption of the pernicious Zionism racism definition, that resolution set a stage for what we are seeing today. A diplomatic effort different than a war effort, different than a terror effort, an effort in the public environment, in the public discourse, to truly say that what is the worst thing you could call somebody? A racist. So when you equate on the grounds of the United Nations and in a resolution Zionism with racism, you are doing the worst that you could do. And although at the 1985 UN Conference on Women in Nairobi, we worked hard with the U.S. government and the Israeli government, those of us who were there as delegates, and my wife Phyllis and I were, in order to put down the continuation of that resolution. The fact of the matter is, it hasn't gone away. It's sort of like a frisbee that keeps flying, or a boomerang that comes back, because it has come back with different approaches, different attitudes, different attempts to continue to paint Israel as that apartheid, racist, criminal state. Look at Durban. The UN conference in Durban called to address racism. This became a hate fest. As many of you know, at the time I was president of B'nai B'rith International. I was chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, United Nations Committee, and accordingly I was designated as head of delegation for our group of Jewish organizations that went there to Durban. And what we saw, the world has paid little attention to, because 9/11 took place just barely 2 weeks later, and Durban and the messages of Durban have been lost on the world, but not lost on the haters, because it was at Durban that the plan was put in place. It was at Durban that the attitudes of the foreign terrorist organizations to gather together and come up with a conspiracy, a plan, a scheme, and a design as to how they were going to next go forward. Of course, the Second Intifada commenced, as we know, in 2000, before Durban, but it heated up right after Durban. And then, of course, with 9/11, who gets blamed? Israel gets blamed, the Jews get blamed, the United States gets blamed for killing our own people. The attitudes of anti-Semitism are centuries, thousands of years old. I'm not going to go through history. I'm going to put it in current context. In the United Kingdom, for example, we have 290,000 Jews living there at the start of 2018. In a couple of weeks, British citizens will go to the polls to elect their next prime minister. We've all read about the hatred that has been spewing forth. Someone polled at 87% of the Jews polled believed to be that Corbyn is believed to be an anti-Semite, and close with both the foreign terrorist organization Hamas and Hezbollah, having described them as his friends. When public officials take these acts, they give license to hatred. Some people prefer to blame it on even politicians in the United States. It makes no sense. It is quite improper to ignore history and to make believe that all of this hatred is caused against us, by us, here in this country. Look around the world at what is being experienced in France. Look around the world at what is being experienced in the attacks all over the world on religious institutions. The holy wars that have been launched. Let's remember, though, that this isn't just about talking about history. This isn't just about talking about defining anti-Semitism or talking about writing about it, as Deborah Lipstadt has done in her new book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now. I'm sorry to say that the topic that we're addressing today has become a little too popular. People are now throwing money as if we never had to deal with this before. They're putting out speakers, and I'm not criticizing us for coming together. I'm applauding the Jewish Policy Center for bringing all of us together to focus in on this problem. What I believe is really needed is a global plan of action. And I am not sure that with all the speaking that is being done from the State Department, from the White House, from the Congress, from organizations, from Israel herself, with all the speaking that is being done, I haven't seen concrete steps that are being taken in order to battle the problem. I would propose to you that we need together, all the different organizations from across the spectrum of American life, those who are our natural allies. Remember the civil rights movement. Remember how we marched together with dignity for all. Where has that message gone? It is time to rebuild that message. It is time for people to stand up and link arms together and to say the hatred that is coming forth, whether it's from the right, whether it's from the left, whether it is from within, we are not going to tolerate it anymore. And we here gathered at Congress, it seems to me, have the power, the ability, the incentive, and the necessity to see to it that a plan of action is put together. Because members of Congress are willing to do something. The White House is willing to do something. The Prime Minister's office is willing to do something. Everybody is focused. Even the funders are willing to do something. Money is sort of coming out of the woodwork that we haven't seen in a long time, and people are trying to understand what is the linkage. I would like to propose to you that we have to understand and recognize that those foreign terrorist organizations designated by the U.S. government and the state sponsors of terror, particularly the Islamic Republic of Iran, the hatred that they spew and the friendships that they curry and the money that they raise in order to fuel terror is all a form of concentrated and a concerted effort of anti-Semitism, painted as if it were just anti-Israelism, just anti-Zionism, and indeed is anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jewish people. They should appreciate the respect we bring to all. They should appreciate the human rights to which we are committed, the human dignity to which we are committed. We have failed in our messaging. We have failed in our plan of action because we've had no plan of action. And every organization runs their own agenda. It is time that we educate our young people. We give them the tools to stand up with pride. We give them the invitation to get involved with organizations across the spectrum, and we give them the necessary elements they need in order to literally say with all of us, we are not going to take this anymore. Hatred of all forms, including hatred of the Jewish people, must be stopped. And the denial of the Holocaust must simply be absolutely rejected, because if we don't understand and respect history, we can't learn anything about the future. One closing point. As president of the American Zionist Movement and working with my wife Phyllis, who's president of the March of the Living, we decided with Ambassador Danny Danon, the Israeli permanent representative to the United Nations, to launch an initiative. We will take, on December 7th, our 4th delegation of UN ambassadors to Poland. We will walk with them into either Auschwitz-Birkenau or into Majdanek to the ash pit. We will walk with them into the room where you can look up and see the potentially operable gas chamber shower heads. And then we take them on to Israel. I would like to share with you that of the 4 delegations, we have now taken ambassadors, and with next week's trip, where we have 25 different country ambassadors coming, we will have taken between 75 and 100 UN ambassadors. Their attitudes have changed. Their views have changed. And I would like to share with you, thank you. I would like to share with you that their votes have changed. We've done a study on their votes. And while I'm not able to share with you all the detail of the analytical study because Ambassador Dermer hasn't seen it yet, and I've promised to send it to him first, I want you to know that country after country things have changed. One ambassador came to the American Zionist Movement Assembly recently, and he stood there tall and proud from South Sudan, and he said to everyone assembled, what you have done in bringing UN ambassadors for the first time to the camps in Poland, and for the first time for most of them to Israel, to meet people, to understand the richness, the cultural diversity, to understand the intellectual honesty, to understand the passion which Israel brings to making this to be a better world. He said, I have one message for you. Keep doing it. And he told the story about how proud he was to go to his president, his prime minister, his foreign minister, and encourage that Israel be given flyover rights over South Sudan like any other nation state in the world. That is accomplishing something. It is the kind of work Richard Schifter and Ambassador Rostow are going to talk to you about as being necessary. I'm not telling you that we've done this in order to have the applause, which I appreciate. I'm telling you it's one initiative of the many that we all must undertake in order to see to it that the hatred is rejected and to see to it that together, even with the United Nations, we build a better world and we build the respect for the State of Israel and the Jewish people that we so richly deserve. Thank you very much.
Rostow.
Thank you, Shoshana, for including me. It's a great honor to be on the panel with Ambassador Schifter and Mr. Heideman. And I want to thank the organizers for putting this together. I was going to speak in three parts because everything is divided into three ever since Gaul was divided into three parts. But I'm going to drop the second part or the first part about anti-Semitism more generally because I think Mr. Heideman has said more than enough, and certainly I can't add anything to that. I thought I'd begin, however, by recalling Bill Buckley's book, In Search of Anti-Semitism, which is a remarkable book for those of you who don't know it. It begins by saying his father was an anti-Semite, and then he picks apart a number of his more prominent National Review colleagues for anti-Semitism. And then he proceeds to say that one of the indices of anti-Semitism is an obsession with Israel. And anti-Israel sentiment, and that the two are manifestations of anti-Semitism. Now, I think defining anti-Semitism is an important issue, which I'm not going to undertake. I'm just going to flag it and why it's important, because people do criticize this and that policy of Israel and vehemently deny that they're anti-Semitic. Indeed, I, for one, if I were able to do it, would change the nature of the road between Haifa and Tel Aviv, the highway that doesn't have exits to the Arab villages along the way. So inhabitants of those villages, to get on that highway, have to drive miles and miles out of the way to find an entrance. But there's a difference between people who criticize particular policies and people who are not so nuanced and who find Israel's actions always objectionable and never justifiable. And I think that's what Buckley was getting at. And I think his point was right. And it's sort of like a wound that is never allowed to heal, and you constantly pick at the scab that forms. And that's the kind of anti-Semitism which the anti-Israel people engage in. Now, I arrived at the United Nations in 2001, right after 9/11, and I had spent most of my career as an international lawyer and as a government official working on UN matters, and considered myself more or less justifiably as knowing something about the United Nations. But there were three things only that surprised me. Well, there were really four, because it is a very complex organization with its own internal dynamics. And for those people who are interested in organizational dynamics, there's hardly a more fascinating place to study. But there were three things that surprised me. one, the anti-Americanism there is much worse than I ever thought. The anti-Semitism there is much worse than I thought, and the Secretariat is much more powerful than I thought it was. And the power of the Secretariat is revealed in the hatred it bears for the Security Council, because it can't control it. Because the permanent members of the Security Council don't need the Secretariat for information, and therefore don't depend on it, and because they really run the Council and decide what gets discussed, when it gets discussed, and what gets adopted and what doesn't get adopted. It's not the Secretariat. The Secretariat's influence is much more powerful in the General Assembly. And so the question I had in mind when I was asked to speak today was, has this situation changed? And I don't think it has changed, notwithstanding the efforts of taking ambassadors to Poland and Israel, which I think is a very fine thing to do. But the fact that their votes have changed tells you that they never had instructions to begin with, and most UN delegations don't get instructions. And I remember one former colleague who was ambassador to Zimbabwe going into President Mugabe and complaining about the way his ambassador was voting at the United Nations, and he said, I have no idea how he's voting, he has no instructions. I know that one ambassador was paid $1 million in cash for his vote at the Security Council on an important resolution. It was money well spent, in my view. But there are certain patterns that persist at the United Nations and have persisted there for decades. One of them is that if you took a poll, a secret poll of delegates at the United Nations and employees of the United Nations and asked them, should Israel have been created? I don't have any doubt the answer would be no, and by an overwhelming majority. The second thing is that there's what I call the Netanyahu excuse. The G77 and the European Union combined for more than 100 votes. There are 193 member states the last time I counted, maybe 194. So they have a working majority. And they blame Netanyahu for obstructing peace, just the way President Obama said, or was quoted in The Atlantic in April 2016, saying Netanyahu could have a two-state solution anytime he wanted, which I think would be news to the Prime Minister. But in any event, it's not just the Netanyahu excuses. I was telling Shoshana before this program, I remember when Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel, and the Nixon administration was accusing her of being obstructionist and difficult and stiff-necked and all the rest of it. So every Israeli Prime Minister, whether it's Golda Meir or it's Shamir or you pick your Prime Minister, Begin, they all get blamed for the fact that there is no peace between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel in those days and Egypt or Jordan or Syria. And at the United Nations, people talk about the Israel-Palestinian issue as if Israel woke up one day and said, oh, let's just take the West Bank, shall we, and Golan and Gaza. There's never any reminder of the history of the conflict or how Israel came to be in the West Bank, or why Resolution 242, which remains the agreed framework for peace, came to be written the way it was, and why President Johnson insisted that Israel had withdrawn without peace in 1957, and it didn't have to do that again. And why no one remembers that just think about it. The Israelis begged the king of Jordan not to attack in 1967. If the Jordanians hadn't attacked Israel in 1967, Israel would not be occupying East Jerusalem or any other part of the West Bank, if it's part of the West Bank. And the issue would be quite different. So I would say that reality hasn't changed. Now, there's Mr. Heideman mentioned that ambassadors say things in private that they don't say in public. I remember going to a lunch with a special representative of the Secretary General for the Middle East and Israel-Palestinian relations. And he said, I thought my teeth were going to fall out of my head. He said Arafat was a mafia boss. Now, you never hear that in public at the United Nations. When the Palestinians use terrorism as a political instrument, when other countries pay them to do it and pay compensation if people blow themselves up attacking Israel, you never hear criticism. And that's just part of the nature of things there. It's everything's of the moment. There's no historical context, and most people don't know the historical context because they didn't live through it, and since they don't read anymore, they don't learn anything. That's just the way life is. So, what is to be done? I think the first thing is to remember that a French ambassador in his first all-night session at the Security Council when I was there said, "We all know that this is the most pointless conflict presently on the agenda. We all know what a solution looks like." And he didn't say then it's insane that there isn't a solution and the people responsible need to smarten up. But what he meant was that the Palestinians had to compromise on their most extreme positions and the Israelis on their most extreme positions. And that there had to be a solution, had to be a compromise that respected the rights of both teams, if you will. Because both sides have rights here. It's not just security versus right. Both sides have rights. And they have to recognize that. And it's not good for Israel to govern other people. And the situation that has existed since 1967 has been very, very damaging to both Palestinians and to Israelis. So it's my view that although the time is not ripe, it almost never is, and particularly in a time when the Iranians are fanning the flames of Hamas and Palestinians and using Hezbollah as a strategic weapon against Israel, that it's almost inconceivable that there can be a solution in this mess or context to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's my view, nonetheless, that the Israelis need to hold out a compromise as eventually what they want, because it doesn't have so many friends. I mean, it has marriages of convenience in the Arab and Islamic world at the moment. Does anybody in this room think those marriages are going to last beyond this particular strategic moment? Who knows? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But wouldn't bet the farm on it. So I think it's really important that the Israelis try to minimize the basis for the constant refrain, the Netanyahu excuse, if you will, which is never going to go away in my lifetime. But they have to behave as if they understand it. And the second thing, I think, is that the United States is always influential at the United Nations, and so no matter who's president and whatever one thinks of whoever's president, its ability to put pressure on institutions at the UN to exercise its budgetary power. It's one of the reasons I've never been in favor of cutting the U.S. contribution to the UN, because money is power. And if you contribute 25% of the budget, people will pay attention. If you don't, they won't. And so I think the United States has to continue its campaigns at the United Nations to push back against the Secretariat, against the funding of the Committee for the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and UNRWA and so on. But it should have no illusion that it can just snap its fingers and change that world. It won't. It's a process. Education is a very important part of it. And the United States has to maintain its position, and it would be nice if we went back to bipartisanship on this, because without the United States there, Israel and the Jewish people would be in real trouble, much greater trouble than they are now. So let me stop there and allow Ambassador Schifter to have the floor, because he's the man we're all here to listen to.
Thank you, Professor Rostow. Ambassador Schifter will speak as our final speaker.
First of all, I would like to say that I find myself very much in agreement with what you have heard up to now. And what I would like to add is the setting in which the Congress can also play a useful role in turning things around, because that really is the challenge. We're dealing here with a problem that does affect Israel. It is a matter of concern about anti-Semitism. But let me also say, that the fundamental beginning of all of this has been really an anti-U.S. effort at the UN. And that is what I would like to address myself to. It was in January 1981 that I received a telephone call from my friend Jean Kirkpatrick. She asked, "Can you be in Geneva next Tuesday?" She then explained that she would like to arrange for me to represent the United States at the UN Human Rights Commission. When I said yes, my years of exposure to the United Nations got started. In the weeks that followed in Geneva, I discovered how central criticism of Israel was to the work of the Human Rights Commission. I also discovered that the United States did not have partners in speaking up against Israel's unfair treatment. And I found out over a period of time that we were here dealing with a phenomenon that dated back to 1974, when the anti-US, anti-Israel campaign at the UN got underway. It did not last long before I discovered that there was a third anti in the UN culture. When I got back from my stay in Geneva, I went to see Jean Kirkpatrick again in New York. That is when she told me, Dick, I'm in a cesspool of anti-Semitism. Because my name is Kirkpatrick, they all think they can talk freely to me. You'll be surprised how widespread it is. In due course, I had a personal experience with that third anti-problem. I can address that later. You can also read about all three antis in the book, The UN Gang, authored by Pedro San Juan, a U.S. citizen who served as director of the Department of Political Affairs in the UN Secretariat in the 1980s, having been recommended for that position by then Vice President George H.W. Bush, who had been the U.S. ambassador to the UN in the early 1970s. San Juan experienced anti-Semitism in the UN Secretariat as a result of a rather strange occurrence. When he had his first meeting with the UN Secretary General, Pérez de Cuellar, a Peruvian, de Cuellar had remarked that people of Spanish background do not normally carry the name of saints. San Juan's response had been that his father had wondered about that as well. The father's guess had been that an ancestor who was Jewish had converted at the time of the Inquisition in 1492 and had decided to take on the name of a saint to demonstrate the sincerity of his conversion. The Secretary General apparently passed the story to a member of the staff. San Juan described that the word was quickly out in the entire Secretariat that the new American on the staff had a Jewish father, which made him an outsider. He described many experiences with anti-Semitism at the UN and reaches the conclusion in his book that, quote, the UN atmosphere is heavy with anti-Semitism, especially in the Secretariat. How did the three antis get to the UN, which was certainly founded on the basis of an entirely different spirit? Here's the background information that I picked up during my time at the UN. It was late in 1973 that Fidel Castro and Muammar Gaddafi, who had been competing with each other for leadership of the non-aligned movement, decided to cooperate with each other and take control of the United Nations. To reach that goal, they needed to form a majority coalition among the UN members. Castro, though active in the non-aligned movement, was of course aligned with the Soviet Union. He was able to get the USSR and all the other members and friends of the Soviet bloc to work with it. Gaddafi, in turn, was able to bring the organization of the Islamic Conference into the coalition. But more votes were needed. To get these votes, Gaddafi went to work on lining up sub-Saharan Africa as well. Many of the states in the region were newly independent and were new to the United Nations system. Gaddafi provided them with funds to encourage their friendship, and the Cubans developed a special UN political program that would be attractive to African states. It would strongly oppose colonialism and place a great deal of emphasis on what was to be called a new international economic order, an arrangement under which developed countries would be required to undertake major tasks in providing economic assistance to developing countries. Another part of the Africa program was to take strong positions against apartheid South Africa. Emphasis was placed on analogizing Israel with South Africa. It was in that fashion that a majority coalition was formed. It would make full use of the UN in efforts to embarrass the United States on the international scene, which was Castro's goal. Gaddafi's goal was more far-reaching. It was to use the UN to end the existence of the State of Israel. It is worth noting that while Gaddafi shared Castro's anti-US sentiments all along, Castro adopted his anti-Israel position only after entering into his agreement with Gaddafi. It was only after that Cuba under Castro ended its diplomatic relations with Israel. But once that had happened, Cuba went vigorously to work on the development of the anti-Israel program at the UN. As for development of the specifics of that program, Cuba's ambassador to the UN, Ricardo Alarcon, played a highly significant role. It is worth noting that Alarcon had been appointed Cuba's ambassador to the UN in 1966. He stayed for his first term at the UN until 1978, that is for 12 years, an unusually long term for UN ambassador. He put together a staff of Cuban foreign ministry personnel who would also stay at the UN for a long time and would learn how to win over personnel from other missions to support of Cuba's policy positions. The brainwashing effort in which they engaged started as soon as a new Third World diplomat arrived at the UN. Anyone who did not go along with the Cuban position would be called a running dog of imperialism. Gaddafi provided funding for Cuba's work, funding that could be used to provide rewards to countries and for ambassadors who would cooperate with Cuba and Libya in their votes on important resolutions directed against the United States and Israel. All of the legislative work was done in the name of the non-aligned movement, which, to be sure, now cooperated closely with the Soviet bloc. When the 1974 session of the UN General Assembly started in September of that year, it was exposed to a novel experience. An outsider had been invited to deliver a speech strongly attacking a member state. It was Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, who delivered a lengthy talk denouncing Israel. At that session, the General Assembly also took a critically important step, which established a precedent that continues to this day to be a major obstacle to an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. It adopted a resolution that defined the right of return to be an inalienable right of the Palestinian people. In the following year, 1975, by the way, I'll explain that later, the point is that the right of return, which is claimed today, is a claim to have a mass migration of 5.5 million Palestinian, Arabs of Palestinian ancestry to Israel, and thereby changing the majority there. In the following year, 1975, the coalition put forward to win African support for its anti-Israel position a resolution that declared that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Before the vote, U.S. Ambassador Moynihan noted in his speech to the General Assembly that the United Nations is about to make anti-Semitism international law. He went on to say that the United States, and I quote, does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The resolution was approved by a vote of 72 to 36. A few weeks later, the General Assembly went on to create the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, a body that has since 1975 led the efforts to delegitimize Israel internationally and advance the cause for the mass migration, as I mentioned, to Israel of Palestinian refugees from Israel's War of Independence in 1948 and the descendants of these Palestinian refugees, all of whom are maintained by the UN in segregated status in the surrounding areas surrounding Israel. There's the UN. These are people, mind you, that have the same ethnicity, speak the same language, same religion as the people among whom they live, but they're supposed to maintain the Palestinian ancestry so as to remain candidates for migration to Israel. The migration would end the Jewish majority in Israel and end the existence of the State of Israel. To enable the committee to function year-round and worldwide, a special office, the Division for Palestinian Rights, has been created in the Secretariat to provide a committee with a full-time staff. Let me note that the UN is expected to extend the mandates of these resolutions once again this year, in less than 2 weeks, on December 3rd. What happened from 1974 onward is that under the leadership of the personnel of the Cuban mission to the UN, the anti-US and anti-Israel propaganda has been disseminated effectively throughout the UN system, reaching the personnel of missions and the UN staff members. The anti-US agenda was initially designed to benefit the Soviet Union by making it clear that the United States finds itself in a minority at the UN. No effort was undertaken by the majority faction to discuss significant issues with the US and seek to reach agreement. That approach has outlasted the USSR. Thus, in 2018, the UN General Assembly adopted 110 resolutions by roll call. The United States voted no on 80 of them, voted yes on 21, and abstained on 9. To be sure, many of these resolutions have limited effectiveness. When I was at the UN, we used to distinguish between the UN world and the real world. The resolutions that do nothing more than seek to embarrass the United States are noted at the UN and not beyond it. The UN program against Israel, on the other hand, does serious damage to Israel's international standing through the use of UN-sponsored anti-Israel propaganda apparatus. Is there anything that can be done to change this? In answering this question, let me take you back to the Zionism is Racism resolution of 1975, which was adopted by a vote of 72 to 36. It was in 1991, after the Soviet bloc had gone out of existence, that John Bolton, then Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, succeeded in getting the Zionism is Racism resolution repealed by a vote of 111 to 25. He did it by reaching out to capitals, to governmental leaderships. That is where that task needs to be performed. That gets us to a very critical point. Some of the votes cast against U.S. positions in the UN system do indeed reflect the political position of the governmental leadership of the countries in whose name the vote is cast. But as to many other votes, the basic decisions on how to vote are made by the missions at the UN, as has been pointed out. The people in many of these missions have been brainwashed, put under peer pressure, and other forms of influencing, including bribery, all used to cause them to go along with the people exerting that pressure. Officials at higher levels in the governmental structure simply do not have the time to concern themselves with UN resolutions on a year-round basis. In the case of many resolutions, we are dealing with questions that really do not deserve high-level attention. But then we get to resolutions that do deserve it and fail to get it. But quite a number of instances we are dealing with resolutions containing provisions that do not reflect the political position taken by the government of the country casting the vote. These are the settings where it is important to reach the head of government and point out why the United States believes that the country should, in keeping with its own national policy, vote with the U.S. You may want to consider, for example, Bahamas and Jamaica vote against Israel. Any good reason? That gets us to the question of, by the way, Senator Cardin is in touch with them. That gets us to the question of how to get the U.S. messages to heads of government. The State Department cannot be expected to skip foreign ministries and appeal directly to presidents and prime ministers. The White House has a long list of international concerns to discuss with heads of government of major countries. It can't be expected to allocate time to discuss UN resolutions with a large number of UN member states. That is where members of Congress have played an important role in getting the U.S. message out. And may I say, that is where the American Jewish International Relations Institute has tried to be of help in providing congressional officers with needed background information. With background information, let me say, in support of what is the U.S. position in the setting. Let me conclude by saying that was at the UN when the Soviet bloc was still in existence. What I found striking was that the Soviet diplomats were not particularly effective in winning votes for their side. As noted, Fidel Castro did it for them. The coalition he created has been built into the UN system, and has outlasted them. But it can be overcome by reaching out to the governmental leaders of friendly countries and capitals. John Bolton did it once and succeeded.
I think we just had a graduate seminar on the history of anti-Americanism and anti-Israelism at the UN. We do have a couple of questions. This program will be over at 1:15, so if you're worried about when the out is. So the first question, and I think Ambassador Schifter, I think it goes to you. How was Nikki Haley so successful at fighting anti-Israel votes at the UN?
As I've indicated, what I found when I was at the UN, that I found to be the problem was that you couldn't really do it in New York, talking to other delegations. What I would do is make a point at the end of the day, getting on the phone and calling our embassies in various capitals and asking them, giving them specific advice in the name of Jean Kirkpatrick as to what they ought to be doing to get in touch with the appropriate officials in the capital to get instructions back to New York. And may I say, there's one situation where then had the following result. We actually were able to get a resolution adopted that criticized the then communist government of Poland for its repression of the Solidarity movement, the liberal movement in Poland at the time. And it carried. As soon as the vote was announced, the Cuban ambassador got up, was recognized, and then pointed at me and said that I had paid people off. What I had done was I had been in touch with the capitals, and they got these new instructions. That's what I had done. This was converted into my paying them off.
Richard, I think this goes to you. These are actually two different countries, but we'll run them together. Have you seen a change in the voting patterns of African countries, first of all?
Yes.
There's a good short answer. And has the warming of relations between Israel and the Gulf countries created any difference in their UN voting patterns?
Not yet.
I love short answers. Here's a question. I think I'm going to give this to you, Nick. Why do UN resolutions matter when they're non-binding in many cases?
Well, I'll try and be short on this because I used to teach a course on the subject. The UN Charter provides that the General Assembly may discuss any matter that is not on the agenda of the Security Council and therefore out of bounds, which the UN General Assembly manages to get around whenever the Palestinians wanted to, and may make recommendations on any subject. It may take decisions on the budget of the organization, and that is the power of the General Assembly, period. Its resolutions may reflect international law, depending on what they say and how many countries voted for them. Security Council resolutions, if they contain the magic word decides, may be binding on all member states, because under Article 25 of the UN Charter, member states agree to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. And the Permanent Five have agreed on a formula regarding the wording of Security Council resolutions, so everybody knows what is and what isn't binding under Article 25. So the run-of-the-mill UN General Assembly resolution or even extraordinary ones like Zionism is racism are not statements of international law, per se.
Thank you. Richard, in regard to anti-Semitism, you mentioned the enemy within. How should the Jewish community handle the vocal groups who claim to be Jewish but endorse positions that undercut Israel, such as BDS? And that, I think, will be our last question, ladies and gentlemen.
We do have an enemy within because we tolerate untruths and don't stand up against the untruths that come from different leaders within the Jewish organization, or those who simply use in their organizational name the word Jewish, and therefore it gives them, they believe, and they assert the right to speak, when they're not truly speaking either the truth, nor are they speaking for the Jewish community at large, nor are they speaking for Israel. And the fact that we tolerate it, I believe, Shoshana, is because of our commitment as people to social justice. We want everyone to feel free, everyone to feel equal, everyone to feel a sense of dignity. And that commitment to social justice, which I applaud, I believe has caused many of our own problems because we close our eyes to the accusations and we allow the lies to continue to permeate. We have to start at the bottom and re-educate the leadership of our own organizations and our young people, because we have lost the narrative on the campuses. Our young people do not have the ability to stand up in their classes. They don't have the will to stand up on their campuses, and they don't even have the will to walk through and simply wave any flag, not an American flag, not an Israeli flag. And the fact that every generation that we've ignored this problem has allowed it to get so bad that now it's in our face and nobody knows what to do about it. Therefore, we have to change the whole thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being a good audience and asking